Hello again. When the war between Russia and Ukraine began last year, many people in this country started hearing the names of cities and districts they'd never heard of in their life. Mariupol, Kharkov and so on. Now, it is an interesting point that although I've never been to Ukraine, I knew the names of those places at once. I'd been familiar with them for years. This is a little odd because I have no particular interest in Ukraine as such. In the same way, I know all about a particular location outside Kiev. Quite a few people my age do, as it happens. Here's a book which was pretty widely read in left-wing circles in Britain, and not just left-wing circles, progressive, with its circles generally, in the 1970s. It has been compared with the work of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I wonder if any readers remember Babi Yar. What about the poem of the same name by Yevtushenko? Yevtushenko was a very popular Soviet poet in the 1960s. Here's the poem Babi Yar. The opening line of that poem was very, very famous at one time. Over Babi Yar, there are no memorials. Babi Yar is the name of a ravine outside Kiev. Many tens of thousands of Jews were murdered there when the Germans invaded in 1941. The Einsatzgruppen who carried out those massacres were ably assisted by the Ukrainian auxiliary police, while the ordinary people of Kiev looked on approvingly. Ukraine had long been a stronghold for the most vicious and deadly anti-Semitism, and there had been pogroms there for centuries before the arrival of the Germans. In fact, many Ukrainians were glad to see the Jews being killed and did all they could to aid the process. I have, as I might have mentioned, quite a large collection of books about the Holocaust. It's a particular interest of mine. And so even apart from learning about Babi Yar as something which was being talked about in the 60s and 70s, I've long been aware of the similar actions taken at cities like Mariupol. Here's what the Wikipedia article on Mariupol has to say on the subject. In October 1941, the Jewish population was nearly extinguished by two operations specifically designed to kill them. The execution of the Jews in Mariupol was carried out by Sonderkommando 10A, which was part of the Einsatzgruppen D. The leader was Obersturmbannführer Heinz Sietzen. Germans shot about 10,000 Mariupol Jews from October the 20th, 1941 to October the 21st, 1941. And so you see, when Mariupol began appearing in the news a while ago, I, and some others with any interest in such matter, thought immediately of the massacres carried out there of Jews, in which both the Ukrainian police and civil population had a hand. Not all the countries occupied by the Germans behaved in this awful way. Denmark managed, with the aid of civilians and the Danish police, to take the entire Jewish population from the country and send them to safety in Sweden. Marshal Mannerheim, the Finnish leader, fought on the side of the Germans, but refused to allow any Jews to be deported from his country. In other words, in some countries, the people behaved honourably during the Holocaust, but not in Ukraine. In some of the death camps in Poland, places such as Treblinka, there were Ukrainian guards who had volunteered for the SS. They had a reputation for being far worse than the Germans when it came to cruelty. I mention all this because if this awareness of what happened at Babi Yar and the role of the Ukrainians in the persecution and murder of Jews is part of my mental baggage, this is 10 times the case among Russians. In Russia, the behaviour of the Ukrainians and the way that they welcomed the Wehrmacht into their country and collaborated with them is as fresh in many people's minds as though it had happened last week instead of 75 years ago. This is one reason that the word Nazi tends to be used by the Russians in the same breath as the word Ukrainian. There is another, of course, and that is that right up until the invasion a year ago, there were many news reports in the West about far-right activity and neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, which suggested that the spirit which had caused the Ukrainians to collaborate with the Germans at Babi Yar and other places was not wholly dead. Here's a typical piece about the situation shortly before the Russians invaded. This is from Harper's Magazine in 2021, and I give a link to it in the description to this video. What do we see in this magazine article? But perhaps Ukraine's clearest departure from the standard model of European liberalism is its proliferation of armed far-right factions. Recruitment posters for these militias can be found across Kiev, calling on disenchanted veterans and disaffected youth to join them in their mission to remake the world by crushing liberalism. Anybody remember any of this? The reason I ask is that since the Russian invasion, Ukraine seems to have become a bastion of Western liberal values and a wonderful democracy which we must protect at all costs. Odd how short our memories are. That article, by the way, begins by saying that Ukraine is among the poorest countries in Europe and the closest thing the continent has to a failing state. Just before the Russian invasion, it was generally agreed that Ukraine was in a terrible state and that neo-Nazi groups were on the rise. It was being suggested that they might start taking over parts of the country. We have now forgotten all these inconvenient facts, of course, in our enthusiasm for helping poor little Ukraine in its struggle against the big bad Russians. The thumbnail to this video shows a celebration of Stepan Bandera's birthday in Kiev. This took place the year before the Russian invasion. For those who don't know, Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist leader who, when the German invasion began, declared glory to the heroic German army and its Führer, Adolf Hitler. He celebrated the invasion by launching pogroms of his own against the Jewish community. That many people in Ukraine still regard him as a hero has to tell you something. There is an awful lot more to the struggle in Ukraine than most people in Western Europe have any idea of, and I, for one, am not at all sure that the mood in that country has changed all that much since Bandera's heyday.